alien life force on board. Okay, it is my pleasure again with this conference to introduce you to some of my best friends in the entire world. Jeff and I first met, going back years ago when my partner and I ran Western Canada under the name Quantum Knights. Back with Roger Lessard. Absolutely. Roger Dodger. I still talk to Roger. He's doing good. I will absolutely. And of course, I'm trying to invoke his potential back into quantum biofeedback. Yes. So for sure, for those that know Roger, But Jeff and I started working together going back, I guess, 12 years ago. About that. And at the time, I was introduced to Jeff as, this guy is the real deal. He's really intense. He's an analytical brain. This is somebody you want to listen to. And as China came onto the spectrum working at the Olympics, Jeff, many people don't know this, but Jeff was actually the first one of us. Jeff and I were the two practitioners who worked on the Olympics. Jeff was the first to go out and spend the first 30 days out there. And if not for Jeff, the Olympics would have been absolutely unsuccessful, because what we were being asked to do in the Olympics was something that had never been done before with the device. They were looking for us to be able to issue a diagnostic report, and we had been trained to never do that. So, we attempted to use the tools available to us, risk profile, Nelson report, etc. And the hospital and the doctors tore us apart in the conference meetings, and they said, these are unsubstantiated claims. Please show me why you're drawing your conclusions. And so Jeff actually foundationally devised the method of systematic searching through the matrix in what I taught on the Quantum Clarity Tour for years. After I picked it up, refined it, and made it much better than his initial idea. But but it was Jeff's work that actually knew how to break it down as a scientific mind as he is, break it down to be able to present it and build that bridge to cross over into medicine. Jeff's career has been vast. 20 years at this. He was one of the initials, like Bala, who was trained both in the biology and the biological understanding of homeopathic interface and what this device is and was back in the day when some of the instructors were very different than the second generation that we had. Jeff has run successful practice for 20 years. Jeff has become an instructor. Jeff has shared and inspired countless people into quantum biofeedback. And by his nature, before all of this, Jeff was a hero. What do I mean by Jeff was a hero? Jeff worked for the Canadian Coast Guard, and Jeff was a Coast Guard agent? What do you call it? Coast Guard what? Superhero. A Coast Guard superhero on the lake that's 10 minutes away from my house, which is the 11th largest body of water in the world, one of the most dangerous lakes in the world. By the way the lake works, you can get 20-foot waves on that sucker, and it takes down tanker ships. Jeff is a hero. And it's in Lake Winnipeg. And Jeff, it's funny about the hero thing, and this is why I bring it up. Because I said to Jeff in a phone call recently, I called him and I said, what happened in your childhood where you needed to save something or something hit you? And Jeff explained, he's like, oh yeah, there was a bunch of different variables, but certainly there was this experience. And it was interesting because you could see how the hero archetype had developed. And he turned around and he said, you know what you are, Adam, right? And I thought he was going to say, I don't know. He said, huh? He said, Adam, you're the rebel. And I said, only with the hero am I able to be the rebel. This is one of my best friends, although I've been neglectful and haven't seen him for the course of the last 3 years, or his beautiful family, a son that will likely be an Olympic contender, an amazing father who's supporting his son, a beautiful daughter, an amazing wife who, if she ever leaves him, hey. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Sutton, one of the best.
Thanks, buddy. I keep telling him to under-promise so that I can over-deliver. I was going to wear my purple dragon outfit, but then I walked by Veronica on my way back to my room, and I was rectified of that decision. So I'm a human biologist. That's actually my background. I have an honors Bachelor of Science degree in biology. I did my honors thesis studying epidemiology of infectious diseases. I have a Bachelor of Health Sciences degree. I went sort of at the end of the search and rescue sort of career, finished an EMTA, which was really just sort of the end of the taking people to the hospital adventures, and at one point was really quite interested in a medical direction. When I kind of serendipitously came across this sort of stuff, and it was working at a health club at the time, and there, one of the only people probably in Canada other than Bala was one of the members at the club, and just in getting to know him a little bit and talking about what he did, I was intrigued enough to go to his office one day and see what it was that he was up to. And this was before the internet was was really rolling along. You could send emails, that was about it. It took forever. There weren't very many pages up, so it was very difficult to do any due diligence. And so, this sort of thing was partly leap of faith, but it was partly enough physics background to understand that everything that happens chemically is electrical. That's a non-controversial point now, but it perhaps was a little bit more controversial 20 years ago. However, it was clear that in the future we were going to be using energy and electromagnetic fields and things like that in order to interact with the body. And I have a bit of a future orientation, like probably most of the people here. And I just really don't like learning things that are already obsolete. I do like reading about history, but that wasn't my choice of academic directions. And I remember taking a course in university. It was really just a basic organic chemistry course, and the professor was a quantum chemist. And he started the course by telling us everything that we were going to learn for the rest of the year was obsolete, and we don't look at things that way at all anymore. All the models are just, they're predictive, but we're sort of into this new world of quantum physics and how energy and matter interact. And that was really in second year university. That was 5 years before I got involved with this. And it kind of turned me off, but it planted the quantum mechanical terminology in my head. And of course, because it was his passion, he introduced us to a lot of those concepts as he went off of the typical course outline. So I'm going to take a sip of water, and then we're going to get back to the point of this in a minute. So as a biologist, one of the things that I've always done, amongst all the confusion that occurs in not just the medical realm, but in our realm, information is changing all the time. We know that most of what we think we know right now will be comedy in 200 years because we get a good laugh about thinking of some of the things that they did medically 200 years ago. There's no reason to think that won't change again. So I've sort of adopted a basic biological perspective. And usually when asking, do I want to do this thing or that thing, I ask the question, does this obey basic biological principles or violate them? And sometimes you can read a new article that comes along, something that says, stop eating butter that we've eaten for thousands of years and instead replace it with this solution of of oils and products that is new, or don't worry about the 8 glasses of water. You'll drink enough when you're thirsty, forgetting the fact that by the time you're thirsty, you've already lost a certain percentage of your fluid volume. Athletic studies show that people have lost endurance and stamina, usually athletically and performance-wise, before they feel thirsty. So things like being hydrated makes a lot of sense, especially because we're composed mostly of fluid. So, or another one, stay out of the sun. Stay out of the sun because it causes cancer. And yet there's no influence on the earth that we've been more associated with in evolutionary history than the sun. And of course, Veronica just finished talking about how we need vitamin D as something that prevents one of our most fatal illnesses. So, do things obey or violate biological principles is sort of a go-to ground that I usually start with when it comes to making recommendations for people and things like that. Today, I figured we would talk about perception and biology, because as a biologist that's been doing this for 20 years, I'm a bit of a survivor, you might say. And I think a lot of the people in this room are too. I think you can probably identify with that to a point, that this has been a bit of a rocky, crazy trip, which is partly why we like it too, because it's fun and chaotic. But I think in order to have been able to keep a practice going, working outside of the system for this long, I've learned a few survival tricks that, in speaking with some of you over the past couple days, I think that I might be able to share some of those. How many of you right now are working, making a living doing this? Okay, and how many would like to? Okay. Congratulations to the people that are making a living doing this, because I think that we're probably at 1% of all the people that own these devices right now. One of the things that helped to get the ball rolling in China, and really my role was to help get through the doctors. That was primarily my responsibility, and that's because I did have a scientific educational background. I'd worked in paramedicine. I grew up in a medical family. I'd worked in hospitals before. And I'm the uptight one out of the duo, as you can tell already. So I can play that game a little bit better, and yet Adam's pretty nice to have around because he lightens up the attitude and everybody lets their hair down. So we were a pretty good team over there. But you can imagine that when you have 100 physicians and academics to get through, if the last time you've met 100 doctors, what percentage of them were a-holes? There's a few anyways, and I know there are a couple in the room too, so I mean no offense by that, but certainly when you have highly educated and academically credentialed people that are taught that they're the top of the academic food chain when it comes to health, I would say probably 30% of them were really difficult to deal with. And so the solution for it was very careful scripting. And that's one of the secrets of the practice that I run right now is years ago I asked a question, to myself, I asked the question, what's reproducible here? Because if you want a successful business, the idea is to find a system that works and be able to reproduce it. And yet everything we've been taught right from the beginning is that none of this is reproducible. You can do a test and you can do another test. You'll get completely different results. In a chaotic system that's self-regulating, just, for example, even if you were to give somebody a sandwich, if I asked you, do you want a sandwich? And you said, sure, I'd like a sandwich. And I gave you a sandwich. And then I asked you, would you like a sandwich? You wouldn't necessarily give me the same answer again. And so, in a real life situation, it's difficult to reproduce some elements. Or as the saying goes, it's hard to step in the same stream twice. It's impossible to step in the same stream twice. So what is reproducible? What is reproducible is your process. The process, the way that you describe things, the explanations, and so on and so forth. And so when it came to, that was part of it. And the other part of it is when a complicated topic is being explained to somebody, you want to do it in such a way that you don't immediately explode their worldview. And the thing about medical doctors is they all understand medical equipment. They know what they do. They understand medical devices. And so if we were to come in and start talking about, the new science and new quantum mechanics and, non-local communication and, correcting biology with energy, all you would hear is the scratchy record sound, and all of a sudden that would be the end of the person's ability to listen in many cases. So the tactic was to start where they are, which is they know what a medical device is. They use them all the time. So to introduce what we're doing, beginning with what they know, and then just take it one step further. We know there's a lot more to it than one step further, but when we introduce it as one step further, we don't violate anybody's belief system. We don't create a situation where we can't substantiate what we're saying, and they were quite receptive to that. So it was really just introduced as, these are all the different things that you've seen before. This was the evolution of biofeedback that was used for anxiety, pain, and stress management. And what we have is the iPhone version. We have the next step, and where things have evolved, similarly to how phones have evolved. Back in the 70s and 80s, phones just phoned people. That's it. And biofeedback, it just read things passively, like an ECG that goes back to the 1920s. So for 100 years we've been using biofeedback. And biofeedback in the 70s and 80s just gave some kind of visual or auditory feedback that told the person that whatever exercises they were doing to relax their stress state was working. And it shortened the learning curve. And so what we have now is simply something that can introduce for the first time an element of testing as well as a therapeutic element that results in relaxation. So in other words, it tweaks some of the different functions of the body in order to induce relaxation. Now, what's the point of relaxation? It doesn't sound like much until you get into a discussion about how the autonomic nervous system works, and there are global impacts on the whole body. So when things were introduced that way, it was off to a good start, because that it wasn't too much for people to swallow. Now, there was another reason for doing things that way, and that was because we're still relatively in our infancy as far as the technology goes. And I think that when we're working outside of the system, and the system has the resources that it does, and it has some of the smartest people in our society that are going through and getting sometimes decades of education and experience, when we're working outside of the system, there's a little part of our brain that has to still keep open to the possibility that we're the wrong ones. Right? And like Aristotle says, one of the keys of an educated mind is being able to hold two ideas in your head without necessarily adopting one or the other. And this is really what critical thinking is about. It's about being able to consider things from different perspectives, and then as evidence occurs, then you can sort of plant your flag on one side or the other. But we always have to consider, and I think this is just what keeps us in this zone of what's called cognitive dissonance that we'll talk about after, where when you have different information that's conflicting, it requires you to think. And as soon as you're certain about something, you've made a choice to stop thinking. And so when we behave, or when we kind of practice in that state of always having to think, then we're open to the new ideas, and we're always evaluating evidence, and we're always considering evidence. And so that's just one of the things that I've done in order to maintain that place where you get to go with the evidence as it comes in. When things are working well and when they're not working well, what do? You sometimes have to change your directions. You have to change what you're counting on. Some people have been finding out that things aren't working as well as they'd thought. Well, there are lots of solutions for that, and we'll get into some of those as we go. For example, the device itself, even if it didn't work at all, what it is a multimedia system that acts like a PowerPoint presentation. And you go from screen to screen, and every screen you go to, there's language there that triggers you and all that you've learned over the years, and the interesting articles you've read and the things that you've learned at school or the things you've learned in your practical experience that make you think dysbiosis came up or bowel flora came up, like Veronica was talking about. Let's have a conversation about this. And what you do is you educate somebody with information that alone can change their trajectory. So it's almost like there's no way that you can lose when you're looking at things properly and with an open mind. And as you go from screen to screen to screen, you go from nutrition to Chinese medicine to Ayurvedic medicine to color to music to, there's so many different, it's entertaining. There's the other thing it is, it's entertaining for us, it's wildly entertaining for the client. So this creates bonding, it creates relationship. One of our top medical problems in the Western world is addictions, which current research suggests is largely related to two main things. One, adverse childhood experiences. When people have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, whether it's trauma or death or being ill or things like this, there's a 13 times risk of addiction. The other is social isolation. So when people are experiencing social isolation, one of the things that is helpful to reduce one of our biggest public health issues of our time is relationship. And in fact, that's what we do. In fact, if we were to go back 30 years, there's research evidence that shows that different microcurrent, pulsed electromagnetic field and microcurrent therapies do all kinds of things with hormone modulation. The most impressive is reducing soft tissue or hard tissue injury time. Like reducing, there's some devices that could potentially reduce bone healing by up to 48%, 50%. And it's been around for decades. So the question isn't, do these things work? It's why aren't they being used? And the answer is really clear, and we even got a little bit of insight into that with the Chinese guys when they were talking. The system doesn't accommodate their use very well. So, for instance, if I was, if you broke your leg and you went to the doctor and the doctor said, well, it's going to take you 8 weeks. Here's some anti-inflammatories and pain meds. We're going to cast it so you can't move it at all, which will cause it to atrophy. But at least it won't be crunching around. But in 8 weeks, we'll see you, and then we'll take the cast off, and then it'll be another 4, 5, 6 months of rehabilitation. And then somebody else said, well, yeah, but I got a device that can probably cut it down in half. Would you like to do it? Well, clearly everyone would want to do it. But then what's the difference? I need to see you 3 times a day for a half an hour, and the system doesn't accommodate that, right? So that's one of the problems that we have. So it's not that there isn't good research evidence that these sorts of technologies are working. It's that it's very difficult to incorporate it into our system the way it is right now, and that's why we're going to work outside of the system. However, the best way to get along is to keep a foot in, because there are still some things that they can offer in terms of information and support and resources that we sometimes need. I work Saturdays at a medical clinic. So, and I do that not because I need to, but because I want to. I want to have the relationship with the physicians. So, because there's nothing like being over your head with something and being able to text your buddy and get a response in 2 minutes from a doctor, on something. Or what do you want? Should this one go to the ER, or do you want to see this tomorrow? And boom, send them in tomorrow, And so those are good kind of relationships for us to have. And they're also useful because, have you heard the term echo chamber? Echo chamber means when you're just listening to people that agree with you all the time. And after a while, you become the crazy ones. And so it's important to kick the door in or kick the door out on your echo chamber every once in a while by talking to people that don't necessarily agree with you. Because that's how you get back into that cognitive dissonance, which makes you think and makes you reevaluate things. Okay. Normally I don't like just reading things at a presentation, but we're gonna start. I have slides. We'll get to them in a second. So I talk about perception with people quite often in my practice, and a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about for the next hour with you will be almost like scripts that I speak with my clients about. So I'm hoping that you can pick up a few ideas here and there, and then I'll give you some references so that you can start writing your own. And back to the Chinese story just for a second. There was one point, when I found something that was working, I found a certain description of biofeedback. They had lines of these doctors, and they would just march them in one after the other, have 15 minutes to 20 minutes to develop a rapport, try to find out as much information as I know about the person, and then it was really my job was to diagnose the person, which really was a loose description. It meant I have to come up with something that's accurate about that person that nobody else knows, because in 15 minutes he's going to go out and debrief with the head of sports medicine China, and that was Dr. Lee. And so what I did is I developed a routine, and I went through the routine over and over again, and as long as it worked, I just did it like a broken record. And there was a point where the doctor that was doing the translating, this was after 3 weeks of that first month, and he said, we were just sitting around bored one day waiting for somebody else to come in that was it was a long day. And he said, Jeff, I was just thinking maybe we can kind of throw some changes into the description, because he was getting bored just saying the same thing over and over again. And I talked to Victor, who was George's partner. Victor was the head of the program, and Victor was having a snooze on one of the hospital beds. And I just said, Victor, what's our success rate so far? And Victor put his head up and he said, 100%. And so I turned to Li Ping and I said, no. There was just no point in reinventing the wheel when the stakes were so high. So when you find something that works, then stick with it. And that doesn't mean that you have to be robotic. But when it comes to setting a rapport, when it comes to what I said about the reproduction, being able to reproduce something, you can reproduce your process. And if you find something that's successful, then stick with that. Because once you develop a relationship, there's all kinds of places that you can go with this later, right? And some of the strictest, most skeptical people, after they've built trust and after they've started to enjoy themselves, then you can take them anywhere. You can do the past lives. You can do the DNA stuff. Then it's like a painter with a paintbrush, right? Yeah. Well, I'd also been doing this for a long time, so I knew how to ask questions in a particular way. And so sometimes if you ask probing questions, because sometimes you can get stuck in a trap when you start asking yes and no questions. So if you're asking yes or no questions and all of a sudden you get a string of no's, then things go off the rails. But if you ask probing questions, then what you get back is you learn things about people. And a probing question is asking something like, well, here's an example. So one guy, blood sugar regulation on the risk profile came up, and I said, blood sugar regulation comes up as a significant risk factor for you. What does that mean to you? And he said, well, I disagree, in Chinese. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Why do you disagree? And he said, well, because I checked my blood sugar this morning before work. And I said, really? Well, are you just in the habit of testing your blood sugar before work every day, or is there a reason why you do that? Well, I'm a diabetic. And I said, okay, well, now let's get into the difference between the blood test that you took and what this kind of test is. The blood test that you have is what's considered medically diagnostic. It's reproducible. It tells you where your blood sugar is at that time. This test tells you how hard your body's working to manage that. It's more like a forecast. So we're not looking at it like a diagnosis. We're looking at it like a forecast. It's all based on probabilities. And it turns out that that's a real dead hit. And so he was like, well, fascinating, and it completely changed direction. So it was really about the understanding or the context. But again, it's, probing. I was good at asking probing questions, and then people sometimes answer the question that they wish they heard. So if you ask things that are open and you focus on relationship and discovery rather than being right, which a lot of us do when we're new, is we're immediately seeking validation because we want to know that we're not idiots and we made a good decision to get involved with this. And so we want to be right, we want it to be accurate, and this, in fact, is a good segue into what I'm going to read, is about something called an external locus of control. And when we have an external locus of control, then we're putting the power in somebody else's hands, which is something that we don't want to do as practitioners, but it's also part of the coaching process and working with clients. Okay, so this is a cool article, and like I said, I don't normally read stuff line by line, but I thought it was so cool that I'm going to read 2 pages of this because it kind of gets into some of the things I wanted to talk about. It's called Collision with Reality: What Depth Psychology Can Tell Us About Victimhood Culture. When Carl Jung, who knows Carl Jung? How do you know him? He's dead. When Carl Jung was a 12-year-old schoolboy, he was shoved to the ground by another child, hitting his head on the pavement and nearly losing consciousness. Instantly, he grasped the opportunities created by this attack. At the moment, I felt the blow. The thought flashed through my head, now you won't have to go to school anymore. I was only half unconscious, but I remained lying there a few moments longer. From this point forward, Jung began having fainting spells whenever he returned to class or attempted homework. For 6 months, he did not attend school. His worried parents consulted doctors and sent him away to convalesce. Jung described this period as a picnic. Beneath the giddiness, however, he sensed something was amiss. I frittered away time with loafing, collecting, reading, and playing, but I did not feel any happier for it. I had the obscure feeling that I was fleeing from myself. Eventually, Jung forgot how his infirmity arose. His invalid status was taken for granted, and he didn't question it or concern himself with the remedy until he overheard a conversation that shook him to awareness. Then one day a friend called on my father. They were sitting in the garden, and I hid behind a shrub, for I was possessed of an insatiable curiosity. I heard the visitor saying to my father, "And how is your son?" "Ah, that's a sad business," my father said. "The doctors no longer know what is wrong with him. They think it might be epilepsy. It would be dreadful if he were incurable. I have lost what little I had, and what will become of the boy if he cannot earn his own living?" I was thunderstruck. This was a collision with reality. Why then, I must get to work, I thought suddenly. At that moment, Jung became a serious child. He went straight to his father's study and began working intensely on his Latin grammar. After 10 minutes of this, I had the finest of fainting fits. I almost fell off the chair, but after a few minutes I felt better and went on working. Devil take it, I'm not going to faint, I told myself, and persisted on purpose. This time it took about 15 minutes before the second attack came. That too passed like the first. And now you must really get to work. I stuck it out. After an hour came the third attack. Still I did not give up, and worked for another hour until I had the feeling I had overcome the attacks. Suddenly I felt better than I had in all the months before. And in fact, the attacks no longer occurred. From that day on, I worked over my grammar and other school books every day. A few weeks later, I returned to school and never suffered another attack even there. The whole bag of tricks was over and done with. That was when I learned what a neurosis was. Almost done. An awkward and aggressive boy who was not well liked by classmates or teachers, Jung must have welcomed the opportunity to escape from school. At childhood's twilight hour, faced with the looming demands of adolescence, Jung withdrew from the world. For a while, his fate hung in the balance as he drifted toward the possibility of permanent self-imposed marginalization and infirmity. In my therapeutic work with, this is the author talking in first person. In my therapeutic work with mothers of teens and tweens, I'm frequent second-hand witness to children who, seeking to avoid the developmental demands of approaching independence, cling to their frailties in much the same way that 12-year-old Jung did. Negotiating such an impasse as a parent can be particularly difficult, as current cultural trends offer unwitting support for young people to claim oppression and illness. I'm going to skip ahead. Personal or collective attitudes that create an invitation to victimhood and infirmity can alter what we expect for ourselves. Embracing a status of oppression or affliction can be helpful as it marshals needed care. However, when we held on too long, it can invite disengagement from life and an avoidance of one's fate. Worryingly, it also has negative implications for personal mental health, as it may foster a sense of helplessness. Finally, thinking of ourselves as oppressed or infirm may inadvertently cultivate what psychologists call an external locus of control. Locus of control is a psychological concept articulated in the early 1950s. Those with an internal locus of control experience themselves as able to influence outcomes that affect them. Those with an external locus of control feel that most of what happens to them is beyond their ability to affect. Through both external and internal loci of control, though they both confer advantages and disadvantages, research has shown that having an internal locus of control is associated with less stress and better health, whereas having an external locus of control is correlated with anxiety disorders. Importantly, an internal locus of control appears to be a decisive factor in determining whether one will be psychologically resilient. As a society, therefore, it's our interest to cultivate an internal locus of control, and indeed the popular notion of grit and mindset are undergirded by locus of control theory. However, some environments are fostering its opposite. I thought that was cool. Do you think that's kind of cool?
Can you post that article?
Sure. But I will tell you, Collision with Reality from Quillette.com. Let's start this presentation. Go ahead. This is one of my favorite quotes I've had on my website for a long time. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it'll direct your life and you'll call it fate. So from Carl Jung. And by the way, those of you that are taking pictures, it's going to be on a Dropbox for you, all of it. So, and in fact, there's the reason I'm just going off here is because you're going to have all the slides, plus I did a protocol. I don't usually do protocols, but I did a protocol with a bunch of different business ideas and professional tips and things to think about, things to discuss. There's a little bit of cueing about scripting and things like that, but I didn't do all the work for you because some of it you have to do yourself. Got to be your words. Okay, next. So what's perception and why is it important? Perception is defined as a process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions in order to give meaning to their environment. And our behavior is based on our perception of what reality is, not necessarily what's real, though. The human mind assembles, organizes, and categorizes information. There's a pretty big subjective element here when it comes to perception, certainly. But let's go to the next slide. There are two important distinctions to make. And I took a course in university called Sensation and Perception. It's one of the most interesting and difficult courses that I took. But the nuances and intricacies of how sensation turns into various perceptions is really neat. But basically, they're distinguished from each other in that sensation is our five senses, or 6 or 7 or however many we really do have, 5 that are classic and then maybe more. The bottom-up process by which our senses like vision, hearing, and smell receive and relay outside stimuli. Have you heard the term bottom-up or top-down? Bottom-up can be considered a quantum mechanical concept, or what is the fundamental nature of reality? Is it material or is it spiritual, or something like that? So in other words, is it atoms that rise up to give rise to consciousness, or is it top down, consciousness gives rise to atoms? That sort of concept. So upward causality is a more classical physics worldview, which is that atoms and material particles are the root of our physics or our reality, whereas there's movement into a new worldview that sort of goes back to the former religious worldview that spirit or some non-material essence is what collapses into a material reality. Anyway, sensation, the reason I put energy there is that energy has a couple different definitions, but physics energy, which is called veritable energy, in other words, verifiable, obey the laws of physics. So energy would be things like sound and light and touch and heat and energy, stuff that, and there are certain laws that energy obeys, which separates it from information. And information, I like to use the term information, but energy is sometimes, like people talk about energy healing, for example, and then they think of somebody who's in Istanbul. And there really isn't any veritable energy involved with that. So it's called putative energy. So it's they're distinguished, but I like to call them energy and information. I think it's a little bit more concise. And it's also a little bit easier to explain to people the difference between energy versus information. Now, the cool thing is that our system does both, right? We're using energy, we're using electromagnetic fields, we're using color, we're using sound, we're using information as well. So, one of the differences between energy and information, for example, would be sound is energy, whereas music is information, or words that I'm saying are information. And of course, your ability to perceive, which is on the other side, has to do with context and things like that. Like for example, when I was in China, I heard lots of sound, but I didn't understand most of what people were saying most of the time. So my perception of that information was different than others. So a top-down way that our brains organize and interpret that information and put it into a context. And a context is influenced by lots of different things. And we'll come back to that. But that's things like your worldview and how you think and what you know and your education and things like that. Now, we also have cellular perception. And cellular perception is still going to be oriented towards energy and information, but we're not consciously involved with it. However, researchers who study it believe that it's very analogous to normal perception in that it's just that it happens in different parts of the body. Like on the, how many of you have read Bruce Lipton's work or have spent some time listening to him? If you haven't, you really should write Bruce Lipton down and go to school. Because he has some fascinating lectures that talk about perception and the biology and how our mind impacts our biology, which is one of my most fascinating things that I like. But also there's a video called Fractal Evolution that is really cool in that it talks about, he draws an analogy between a membrane of a cell and a computer microchip and how they work. And when you think about the ones and zeros, which is called binary, so things are ones and zeros. In other words, the way that computers communicate is they're either on or off, is really not different than how a membrane works and how the different receptors work on the surface membrane of a cell. For example, voltage-gated sodium channels, depending on the concentration of sodium inside or outside of a cell or based on charge of a cell, will open to let sodium in or open to let sodium out. It's like another one or a zero. And so that works with certain chemistry. It works with vitamins. It works with chemistry as well as electrical, as well as proteins, things like that. So our membrane is semi-permeable, meaning that it's open or closed based on signaling or perception that occurs right on the membrane. So in a sense, the membrane of a cell is also analogous to the brain of the cell. And he talks about how we used to think that the DNA was the brain of the cell. Back in school 30, 40 years ago, we were taught, you see the little nucleus in the middle of a cell, and it was taught to us as an analog of a brain because that's where all the information was. But early on in his research, he found that you could denucleate a cell, you could pull the nucleus out of a cell, and the cell would still live for sometimes a couple months. Unless what happened? You changed the environment. And if you change the environment, then the cell would die. Why? Because it's the membrane, because the membrane perceives the environment, and the nucleus was simply just a filing cabinet of information. It was like a filing cabinet of blueprints that perception would influence in order to respond. So the DNA, the genetics, was really only there to respond to changes in what? Perception or environment. And so he's done a really good job over the years of teaching how perception and environment actually have genetic impacts on what causes our genes to express one way or the other. So we don't just have a genetic mutation spontaneously in a sense that a blueprint jumps out of a filing cabinet and just builds a bridge in the middle of the desert for no reason. There's got to be a perception that creates that sort of response. There's a purpose. There's a reason. So what would normally happen is a contractor would see that there's a river and need to pull out a bridge to build or pull out a blueprint to build a bridge across it. There's a reason for it. This resonated with me a long time ago because as a biologist, I was taught that everything to do with biology is all about homeostasis, balance, survival, natural selection, these sorts of things. So the idea that genes were just screwing up out of the blue, it never really computed with me. And I kept an open mind to the possibility that maybe we were wrong. Maybe we were wrong about the way that things work, and maybe in a little bit more time we might see that biology is smarter than that actually, and that there are some of these things even that we consider disease we might not be looking at properly. Maybe they're responses. Maybe there's certain responses biologically. And there are medical models that we'll get into later that talk about this, but there's not enough time to delve deeply into it. Okay? So here are some of the factors that affect perception. So needs and motives, known and unknown. And we'll get to that in further detail as well. But of course, what we need impacts our perception. For example, if you're starving to death and, there's an apple on a table that isn't yours, you're more likely to, what you think is right or wrong will be impacted by whether you need to eat that apple or not. Self-concept, and let's put this into a context. Let's actually put this into a context of meeting with a client for the first time. Because meeting with a client for the first time is... they're going to have perceptions. They're going to have ideas based on what they've heard before and things like that. So, so as a practitioner, we're sometimes concerned with what button do we have to hit that just takes this house of cards down? Like, what's the button that just fixes everything and the pain's gone? Everything's been resolved, and we love that when spontaneous things happen. But again, if you want to be successful in your business over the long term, the most important thing to do in the short term is learn how to manage expectations. And if you get good at it, or when you get good at it, then if somebody feels really good after meeting you, then you'll get the credit. If they feel horrible after meeting you, you'll get the credit, and it'll be good. And if they don't feel anything, you will have prepared them for that possibility and set up an expectation that it needs to take some time and you need to meet together. And so you won't be able to lose. So managing expectations is all about understanding what affects our perceptions. So self-concept, insights, self-knowledge, people's accuracy. Part of what our job is doing is helping to take disturbed information and make it better. It doesn't always have to be perfect, but is it better? Does the person, if you don't know anything, you can be successful if your client feels better about themselves for having come to see you today. Because that, behavior, any repeated pattern of behavior that you're trying to create is done so with rewards, right? That's just basic psychology. If you want to create a repeated pattern of behavior, and from a business standpoint, you need to create a pattern of behavior of returns and referrals, which means that they have to be rewarded for coming to visit you some way or shape or form, and that's in accomplishing some of these things. And that's also better for them because we know we're good for them. We know we're providing access to something that's healthy and beneficial. You know you want to help them, so it's not selfish to want them to come over and over and over again. You know that the more times that they do, the better your chances are going to be of helping to get them on a better trajectory. So sometimes people aren't functioning with accurate information about themselves, and that needs to be corrected. Or they don't have insight. And that's one of the reason I picked biology and perception was because with this kind of biofeedback system, we have such a cool tool for taking the unconscious and making it conscious. That's the whole point. The whole thing that Jung says is that we're behaving according to these unconscious ideas because we don't know. Like even though you know your body better than everybody, your body knows everything. And so when it puts it into your language, then you can have insight, which affects perception. Past experiences, trauma, abuse, those are bad things. Education, of course, or miseducation. Not all education is good education. In fact, there was a quote that I like. It's one of my favorite memes. It's that the illiteracy of the 21st century isn't about whether you can read or not. It's being able to unlearn and relearn because sometimes we're learning the wrong things, and it's a challenge to have to unlearn and then relearn. Beliefs, worldviews, things like that, cultural upbringing, all affects our perception. A particular situation, it's difficult to help people with stress management if their leg is on fire, for example. There's no button for that. So environment, time, whether they're fatigued, the location, the lighting, the environment of your space is all important. What your office looks like, if it's a dive, if it's stinky, if it looks professional, all those kinds of things matter about whether people are going to be sticking with you or not. And then expectations of a person, place, or experience. And this is the one where most younger practitioners or newer practitioners get stuck. And that is that you want to deliver everything right off the bat. You want to do everything, and the million times that I've heard, how do you do a session in less than 3 hours? And the answer is do 3 sessions. It's really simple. You have to break it up, but you break it up and you communicate the plan with somebody and let them know that these are the things that we need to do. These are the things that we're going to do today, but then I need to see you in a week so that we can do those things. And then another week so that we can finish up, and then we'll have a really clear idea about where we want to go from here. And so I need you to stick with me in order to get it all done, because it took you 15 years to get here, and now at least, give me 15 visits to see if we can turn things around. And the turning things around isn't all about just what button you push. It's about the process. It's about your influence with them on an ongoing basis, using your multimedia PowerPoint that is the quantum biofeedback system. And then current psychological state matters as well. And those last two we're going to get into in a bit more detail. Okay. So expectations of biofeedback. So this is just a slight tangent for the people that I've talked to over the last couple of days when it comes to setting things up from the start. So from a sensation standpoint, they've already heard things. These questions are useful to ask on a first visit so that you know where they're coming from. What have you heard? Who told you to come here? And what have they gotten you into? But what have they told you to expect? What do you expect? What have you seen or researched? Have you read about biofeedback before? Have you ever heard about biofeedback before? What experiences have you had? Have you been with another practitioner? Have you tried a different system? Are is it your first time leaving the medical system? Because, if it's the first time leaving the medical system, they have a certain way of thinking about curing disease with pills or curing disease with something. Sometimes they don't want to cure disease with pills anymore because it hasn't worked, so they want to cure disease with an herb. And they want you to tell them what herb they have to take to cure their disease. it's the same level of thinking, right? And sometimes it's our job to change the level of thinking. It's not all about what is the thing that cures the disease. It's understanding more. What are the barriers? What are the stresses? What are the things that are getting in the way? What do we have to change about, the things that are happening in the subconscious that drive most of our behavior? And so again, dealing with understanding what the needs and motives are. Why are you here? What do you want to accomplish? What timeline do you have in mind? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You program their expectation. So most of what drives our behavior isn't what we're thinking in our conscious verbal mind. It's the unconscious conditioning that has happened since we were born that drives most of our behavior. And so we can, part of our job in affecting perception is a reprogramming or a re-education process. Okay? So I don't want to sound like a broken record about this, but how many of you have heard me talk before? Okay, a few. The thing, I would apologize for reviewing something that I've spoken about a million times, but I'm not going to apologize because I keep hearing from practitioners that I've taught this to over and over again that they don't use it. And you don't have to be a biologist to be able to describe this, but it's a script that most people should incorporate on a first visit or during seminars or anything like that when you're educating people about what you do. Because in my opinion, it's the biggest home run script. So what is it we do? Biofeedback is recognized for stress management, pain management, muscle re-education. So that's it. Now, stress reduction doesn't really sound like much. It doesn't sound like, well, I'm a physiotherapist and I help rehabilitate people, or medicine, I diagnose and cure disease and perform surgery. These sound much sexier sometimes. But what stress management is global. So the autonomic nervous system is, like I said about meeting with the doctors, when you start with something that everybody understands, so we're not hurting their current perception, but we're going to take them one step further with this description. So the autonomic nervous system describes a generic fight or flight versus rest and digest mode. How many people know this a bit? Okay, how many people are going to be bored? Hopefully nobody. Your hand lingered, okay. Sorry to you, but that's it. So if somebody busted in here with a chainsaw right now and started waving it around, then all of us would have a very similar generic stress response. And it would be fight or flight switch. We would have a perception of a threat response, and all of these processes would engage. We would have an immediate change in cognitive function. If I said, Kathy, what did you have for lunch yesterday? There's no way Kathy would be able to access that information at the time because all the higher cognitive functions are shunted. Pupils dilate, so you can see the monsters in the dark better. Saliva dries up, which is why I keep having to drink water, because when you're nervous, you have to do that. Lungs dilate to bring in more oxygen. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up. The muscles will see up to 1,000% more blood flow. The liver starts converting stored starches to blood sugar, so you have fight or flight energy, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So now what happens when somebody may not be dealing with a chainsaw battle, but instead they're given a cancer diagnosis, which some people perceive as a death sentence, which is traumatic, or they have 5 kids and 2 jobs and they're doing it themselves, or there are lots of reasons why it might not be quite pinned to the extreme, but we might not be spending half of our time back and forth in a rest and digest state. So you start spending 60, 70, 80% of your time, 90% of your time in a stress-on state, and you have chronic cognitive deficits. You have chronic fight or flight, which is not a great position to be in when it comes to maintaining healthy quality relationships. So relationships tend to blow up. age-related visual decline, age-related dental concerns, lung disease is 3 of the top 10 deaths pretty much, heart disease, top killer in the Western world, elevated blood sugar, diabetes, one of the fastest growing illnesses in the Western world, hormone imbalances, adrenal fatigue. These are all some of the most common diseases that we're running into in our health system. And what this is suggesting is that there's an underlying mechanism that guaranteed is present for all of them. And so regardless of what the disease is called, whether the doctor is treating diabetes or the doctor's treating heart disease, there's a stress element to it that must be addressed. Otherwise, you can't flip the switch. And if you can't flip the switch, then healing can't really happen. Crisis med can happen, but healing can't really happen, which impacts our treatment outcomes. So cancer treatment outcomes are tougher to see in the conventional system. They have successes, no question about it. But a lot of successes are now because people are starting to bridge out and do multiple things, and there's a greater awareness that we have to deal with mental health issues, particularly when somebody's been traumatized by a diagnosis like that. So it's not just the illness itself, it's the whole trauma and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. That we do. This is what we do. So all of a sudden, what we're doing is actually an integral part of what medicine should be and what it has to be. And it's the missing link. It's dealing with perception, and it's dealing with how that impacts biology. Cool? Okay. So if you get used to explaining that, it can take 5 minutes during an introduction. I usually just hop online. I go, autonomic nervous system, punch up my favorite little picture, and explain to people how it works. And the point is to justify to them why they're doing biofeedback, because biofeedback is like the archetype of therapies that helps with flipping the switch. All of the buttons you see me pushing are working with little tweaks of stress responses that are determined electrically, that we're going to influence electrically to try to re-educate the nervous system to come down. Because when you're sitting in a comfy chair with your feet up, you're supposed to relax, and yet people sometimes, even with their environment settled properly, they still can't, and so they need help. And you might find it interesting that one of the other things that does that are the CBDs and stuff like that are becoming so popular. I remember a presentation that I still have somewhere, and it was just about basic biofeedback, and there was a quote from, at the time, the Merck pharmaceutical company's head of research and development, and the quote was awesome. It was, "In order to dominate the future, we need to dominate the autonomic nervous system." And I thought, oh, that's just a great quote, because it gives the whole impression of what the system is like, but it also gave away the secret, which is that dealing with the autonomic nervous system is the future of medicine the way he saw it. And I got a giggle because I was like, well, that's what we do. Isn't that cool? So when you're using the biofeedback, all the different kinds of programs, it's like dropping an apple and you can't miss the ground. When you are working with people, there are so many different programs there, plus the relaxing interaction that does what you're trying to accomplish. Anyway, I don't need to get into the parasympathetic side because it's the opposite. So, when people relax, then all the blood goes back to digestion and all that kind of stuff. And then you're assimilating and you're repairing. Okay? I completely ripped this off the internet. I didn't make this one. There are a couple like that. But I just wanted to make the point, and I'm going to skip pretty quickly over it because most people have probably seen this before. But, our conscious mind is probably driving 10% of what's going on, if that. And so what that means is when we're up here and we're thinking, we're not observing the behaviors. We're not really connected with the reasons why things are happening. And most of the reasons why things are happening the way they do and the decisions that we're making are often based on conditioning. And I like the little point there in the unconscious mind, memories, beliefs, habits from age 0 to 7. Have you heard the old, some people attribute this to Aristotle. Some people attribute it to Jesuits. There was a Jesuit educator. And like the old saying goes, you can never truly trust, this is a quote, you can never truly trust the accuracy of attribution of quotes on the internet. Abraham Lincoln. But so it's either Aristotle or it's a Jesuit educator that said, "Give me a child to the age of 7 and I'll show you the man." And that was because for hundreds of years they've known that if you indoctrinate people into a certain belief system, then those first 7 years drive much of their future behavior, belief system, worldview, and all that kind of stuff, which is, it's been hundreds of years, and yet I was just listening to something the other day with modern psychologists talking about the same thing. Other things like traumatic stored events, phobias, addictions, all that kind of stuff. This is it's all deep down inside. But we have the system that brings it to conscious. So it doesn't direct your life when you can bring it to conscious. Okay? This is just a reminder of the mind-body problem back in the day. And this goes back about 400 years. And Descartes was a philosopher, and he was one of the first people that helped to break the conflict that was happening between the religious and the evolving scientific community. There was a great deal of conflict over trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality. Was it spiritual? Was it material? And the scientists had a really good methodology for discovering truth. And perhaps truth isn't always the right word to use, but certainly coming up with reasonable explanations for why things happen the way they do. And the conflict was difficult because of the exiles and the cross burnings and all these sorts of things. So the idea of let's separate the world into the scientists, you can have the physical stuff, and the priests and whatever, you can have the spiritual stuff, and we'll just keep everything apart and we won't screw with each other's territory. And it worked for a few hundred years. But where we are now is sort of things are merging back together again. So information philosophy views the mind as the immaterial information in the brain, which is seen as a biological information processor. Mind is software in the brain's hardware. The stuff of the mind is pure information. Information is neither matter nor energy, though it needs matter for its embodiment and energy for its communication. I like that one. That was good. So I like that one because it's a better description of the idea of simply just energy information. But that's why I like to use the common language. So the language of the scientific establishment is starting to accept this, and so it's useful to play along with it and carry it forward. And also, when we're using language like that, it doesn't offend the people's basic belief systems. Okay, this is my mind-body problem. Okay, this is. I just wanted to bring this up just as sort of a point to study it. I'm not going to get into epigenetics, but I wanted to use the slide just as, again, like the PowerPoint to trigger a script. And I already talked about Bruce Lipton, but the idea of how perception and environment impact how our genes express. So what that means is that we're not talking about a wooey idea. Okay, and I'm not downplaying wooey either. I think that's the creativity that makes things interesting. The creativity that, like if somebody handed you a paintbrush and said, well, here I made this thing. Here's what I do with it. I paint this buffalo on a cave wall. Here, we'll see what you can do with it. And somebody paints a room red and somebody paints a tree. There's lots of different things that you can do with the tool. But from a business standpoint, operating with a more common sense or a more accepted sense of reality is a better starting point before you get into the rest. So, even if you were, one of my clients is a physiotherapist that just retired, and she worked at a hospital in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And they have a tight little community, and she's a great person. They have a lot of good friendships in the hospital. But when she retired, her friends all totally roasted the hell out of her. And so they'd been preparing this for months. They got together, all of her friends and colleagues at the hospital got together, and they did skits. and things like that. And one of the skits that they did was her going to the biofeedback guy, because she came to me a couple times. She came to me a couple times because she's the sister of one of my good buddies. And the first time was with GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disorder. And her doctor was prepared to do a surgery where they wrap a muscle around the cardiac sphincter. And she was told that there was a significant risk to it. There's a possibility it wouldn't work. She had been trying a variety of different things over the years, and I think I saw her twice, and GERD was gone forever. Because of good dietary recommendations and some of the things that Veronica was talking about, dealing with the gut microbiome, dealing with enzymes, helping to eliminate certain foods, and then dealing with stress state. Because again, digestion is inhibited in a stress state, so sometimes you don't even need stuff. But then the second time she came was after she had heart palpitations, and her heart palpitations were super easy. It was like one visit and they were gone. So she, of course, went back, and she'd been talking about this at the hospital, raving about how great it was. So the skit they did was the gonculator appointment. And so she had to go. She had to go to her visit, and of course they had a toaster on the table, and she was supposed to stick her hand in the toaster, and then they were going to read her future. Which, to this day, I think is the most hilarious thing. So just imagining her with her hand in the toaster while somebody pretended that they could see her future was funny. But my point actually is that even if you were sitting there with your hand in a toaster and somebody told you that you need to be exercising routinely for optimal health, that you need to deal with, like so many of you have been doing this for so long. You could be standing here too, talking about the facts that you know nutritionally, the good advice that you can give people, the good advice you have given them. Managing your environment because it impacts your genes. So if your genes are so important in biology, and these are the things that impact your genes, then you as a practitioner, as long as you're seeing people on a regular basis, are going to have that kind of influence over them. And you're going to be changing their perception simply with the information that you bring to them. Okay? So some of the issues that we run into in managing perception are things like narrative. Narrative is a storyline. And I don't know, one of the things that I've really realized over the years is how, and again, it's kind of partly my wonky brain, but like I said, I live in the world of cognitive dissonance and it's just been how it's been over the years. From starting to be in this field where not everybody understands what we're doing, and we're trying to communicate difficult things to people that violate what they think they know. It's a different narrative. So, and I have clients too who sometimes come from religious worldviews that don't look at medicine the same way. And so these people grow up with a different kind of critical thinking process. Sometimes we would argue that they're more dogmatic. Sometimes they would argue that the other side is dogmatic. But the whole idea of dogma is unthinking belief in a certain perspective. And I've always liked this this picture because it suggests that sometimes there are different perspectives and they can be right, but how else can you look at it for delving deeper or knowing more? And in this case, both of the different directions are true, but there's more to it, and you can look at even what's going on with news and stuff like that these days. I listen. I'm not going to go political, don't worry. But the idea that sometimes I listen to Scott Adams, the Dilbert dude, and he's kind of fun the way he thinks things out. But he talks about 2 movies on one screen. And he'll talk about how you can watch one news channel and then the other news channel, and they're talking about the same thing, but it's like you're watching 2 movies on the same screen, and it's just completely unbelievable how conflicted it can become. Next, actually, go back just for a second. So, I probably should have put the cognitive dissonance slide next, but that idea of having two different ways of looking at information can also be what happens even at conferences like this, where you have people that stand up in front, and I have my ideas on how things are supposed to be. Somebody else has their ideas on, and you can go through it for 3-4 days of listening to different ideas about what we think and what you have to do to make it work and all that kind of stuff. Which is kind of why these are good, because you do get different perspectives, and you get to pick and choose which ones you were glad you heard and which ones you didn't, but also to challenge your own thoughts. So this is just a reminder. And to speak nicely of it, actually, because the placebo effect is considered the enemy in medicine, and it's vilified as the evil dragon. But in reality, like what Bruce Lipton says, the placebo effect, potentially up to 30% of medical effects are probably entangled with placebo effect. Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist, and he says the placebo effect is for all intents and purposes, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but it's the humanistic part of the healing process. And what it means is what you believe can help people heal or feel better, and anything that makes more of that is the future of medicine. There's really no consequence to it. And then I just wanted to punch surgery, the ultimate placebo. This is a really interesting one. There's an article, and I did reference it, I think at the bottom. There's a good article. Ian Harris is a orthopedic surgeon, and he wrote this book, and what they actually talked about were sham surgeries. And it's really remarkable how few studies there have been that have looked at surgery against a placebo. It's been sort of taken for granted, and oftentimes we know that surgery is one of those things there's no alternative for. If you need a surgery, you need a surgery, but whether you need a surgery or not, it needs to be investigated further sometimes. So he found that there were 4 different kinds of things that were very common. One was like orthoscopic knee surgery, one was spinal fusion, I think there was heart stent. There are a few that were almost common standard of care surgical procedures, and when they were tested against sham surgeries, for example, the orthoscopic knee surgery, people would have knee pain and just try a million different things. Nothing ever worked, and so they would demand surgery. And so they would take half of the people. Let's say there are 100, because I can't remember all the details, but say there are 100 people. 50 of them they would do a typical orthoscopic knee surgery and clean out all the gook and debris and stuff like that. And the other 50, they would cut a few holes in the knee and stitch them up and tell them they did it. And the results were indistinguishable clinically. Indistinguishable with some of these other things like the spinal fusions and stuff like that. So he went on to talk about perception. He went on to talk about how sometimes people had in their head that it's just going to take a surgery, that's all it is, so I need to be cut. And so he would cut them and sew them back up, and it would work as often as actually going further with the surgery. Yeah, go ahead. Did the patients know they were part of a trial? I think that in order to get, well, you know this, in order to do a study, you have to know that you're a part of a trial. Yeah, because you can't do human research without informed consent, right? So people have to know that they're a part of a trial. That's as far as I know. Yeah, even though you know, and what you're saying is even though you know that you might be conned completely, you're still going with feeling better. Yeah, it's very interesting. Now, I mean, clearly not everything. Placebo doesn't work for everything, right? Like if your head goes flying off, if you're in a car accident or something and you have a crushed skull, there are some things that you can't ethically test placebo-wise, and there are also things that are just undeniably required. So, placebo, I would say that it is, the effect is going to be more important when things are self-limiting or they're non-critical. I think that goes without saying. Anyway, so the book, Surgery, the Ultimate Placebo, I haven't read the whole book, but I've read a number of articles and listened to the interviews, and the guy sounds really entertaining. Okay. Some of the problems that these are some of the traps that we're going to end up running into now as well. So some of the traps from a practitioner standpoint that we run into, number one that I put up here was scope of practice. And our industry has had some corrections over the years that are good, because some of the early attention that happened with media and things like that were really triggered by people making claims that couldn't be substantiated properly. And that's because at the time we were new and we weren't totally at peace with our niche. And we weren't totally at peace or educated properly about what the true scope of practice and the ethics and things like that are of our new field. And so we were just like, woohoo, this is awesome, let's go. And we were, people were not speaking as clearly as they should, and so that we had a correction, suffice it to say. So scope of practice is based in different states and provinces. It sets a legal framework for service delivery for specific health professions, obviously, and it defines the parameters of practice for a professional. Limits practice to people who successfully complete specified education or training. Now the thing is, biofeedback in both U.S. and Canada anyway, and I'm sure most of Europe, I believe, is considered insignificant risk, and so it doesn't require a license. Now that alone is really kind of comical in my opinion, because it means that the only things that have a license are things that can hurt you. But that's true, and of course there's a good reason why that is, because if it could potentially hurt you, then there needs to be a different standard of ethics, education, credentialing, things like that. But it is kind of funny. So I have that conversation often with people when they come in and ask, are you covered by insurance? And I was like, well, I can't hurt you, so no. Restricts the use of title or credential to license holders in the profession. So it's clear to remember that we have to maintain our communication in the stress context. And when you really come to peace with it, and and especially when you use sort of that autonomic nervous system as your guiding principle, and understand that you don't have to be right about every detail. It's not your responsibility to diagnose things. So a lot of people get the device and then they feel overwhelmed, like they need to have an MD or a PhD to go with it. It's great if you do, because boy, you have a lot to talk about during a session if you have all that education. But it isn't your responsibility to cure people. It's an innate process in the individual, and you're supposed to help them develop their internal locus of control, not assume it for them, right, for their own health and benefit. Designated to provide consumer protection and monopoly. Okay, thank you. So cognitive dissonance I brought up, and cognitive dissonance can be used in our practice. So the definition of it is the discomfort you feel when you do something that is against your beliefs. It also occurs when confronted with ideas that conflict with your beliefs. So we talked about an echo chamber. And you see this kind of stuff on Facebook all the time. Like you look at a certain kind of group, and the group will all be like praising one thing, and then somebody says something, and then everybody attacks them like they're the devil. And that happens. It's constant. Like the kids these days have to deal with this sort of stuff, or anybody that has an opinion about something. If you're so bold as to speak out, you're going to get assassinated online these days. But so the echo chamber is something that it's fun to be a part of sometimes, but you certainly have to step outside of it occasionally in order to think. So an example of cognitive dissonance would be somebody who cares a lot about money and grew up in wealth and marries somebody who is the worst when it comes to managing money. Another example would be somebody who believes that smoking isn't healthy, but they smoke. Okay, and I'm not criticizing anything, but this is the cognitive dissonance. It's a discomfort. Every time you do it, you feel like, what the hell am I doing? And it could be, me too. Like I work with athletes. I'm a strength and conditioning specialist. I've worked with Olympic athletes for a long, long time, and I'm not in the best shape lately. not working out as much. So there's cognitive dissonance over that kind of stuff. So the effects of cognitive dissonance is there's discomfort. There's mental, emotional discomfort. Now, to reduce the dissonance, there are basically a few things that we can expect. One, you either deny evidence and pretend you didn't see it. You reject the belief. So, for example, if you're sitting with somebody and trying to explain how we can run electrical current through their body and it helps them to relax and heal, and they just don't like it, then they can reject that possibility. So denial. Rationalization. Here's my favorite example of rationalization. It has to do with the concept of germ theory, which I don't toss out with the bathwater, but as a biologist, I look at germs as part of an ecosystem like flies at a garbage dump. And so while our concept of being infected with something causes disease, and it appears that the evidence backs that up, when we have people who are suffering and we look and we find a bunch of bacteria on board, we could say very easily, well, this bacteria is causing that disease. And in the past, there used to be tests to determine that kind of thing. In fact, back in the day, there was Koch's postulates where if they wanted to determine if a certain pathogen was a cause of disease, they would take somebody with a disease and they would isolate some pathogen from the bloodstream, and then they would put it into another organism or another individual. If the individual got the disease and they could re-isolate the pathogen, they'd be like, that caused it. And it's been completely abandoned at this point. So it's like we've moved beyond, and now we just kind of determine, and based on genetics and DNA markers and things like that, we find it. But it's kind of gotten to the point where we almost say, well, every time we look at a garbage dump, we find these flies, so clearly they're making this. And so it's a little bit backwards thinking, where really there's sometimes these things are there because of the environment. They're there because of the milieu. So what happens sometimes, especially I love this during flu season, is the rationalization. So when you get people with, the flu comes around, January's flu season, so the cough starts to show up. So CDC starts to do some sampling. They determine, well, this is probably the one that's causing it. And what isn't being done is testing all the people who aren't sick. Because what would happen if you took 100 people that have the flu and you find a certain strain, and then you test 100 people that don't have a flu, and you have an equal or similar distribution of that same organism or pathogen, but they're not sick. And what you have to do, because that would create cognitive dissonance, is you have to then rationalize that, well, these people are immune, they've been exposed, they have a different immune system, their immune system's healthier, and so what you end up having to do is rationalize why your theory is not working for some particular reason. So right or wrong, it's just, I feel that that's an interesting example of how you rationalize. And then, of course, the fourth is the one that we use to our advantage, which is change the behavior. So sometimes part of what our job is to create a little bit of cognitive dissonance. It's to introduce people to opposing views or to introduce a new concept, and then to watch them stew in their juices for a minute and then say, okay, here's what we want to do about this. I need you to make this change and I'll see you in a week. And in a week we're going to talk about it and talk about whether you've noticed change or whether we need to move on from there. Does that make sense? Okay. This is another one of the things that we come up against. Confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. And this is just something useful to be aware of, because we're all susceptible to this. Every single one of us has it. It's impossible to avoid completely, but to be aware of it, again, takes the unconscious and makes it conscious. So, what we tend to see is partly, based in reality, partly based in what we want to believe. Okay? I love Calvin and Hobbes. Okay, next. So, how we're going to change perception with clients, access to methods of stress reduction. Our job is to simply provide them access. Almost everything we do helps. Second, entrainment And constructive reinforcement, so the process, the mechanism that the bioresonance uses to actually create changes in the body has to do with synchronization of signals. So when there's an external signal that's very similar to an internally generated signal, it turns out that our body will synchronize with it if it wants. And that's something that's been shown with sound and light and music therapy and brain waves and with flashing lights and brainwave entrainment. And that similar principle works throughout the rest of the body. So entrainment is a worthwhile thing for people to read a little bit about so that you can add the entrainment script when they say, how does this work? Constructive reinforcement, along with coaching, is simply reinforcing the things that you're educating people about as you go. And I think we're down to 5 minutes left. So, education. So all of the stuff that you have up in your head is a part of the process that changes perception. The recommendations that you make, how entertaining you are. I'll be done in 5. I'll beat you. The relationship and the bonding experience that you have with the person. The coaching and accountability, and of course using placebo effect and maximizing it for maximal benefit. And to talk to people about it. As you talk to people, you educate them about what the placebo effect is. And the only reason why it's bad is because it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to beat it because it's so good. So when we can take and if it's really just the information and the perspective that people have that is what creates the placebo effect in the first place, then we want to use it to our advantage. Okay, skip that. These are just a couple of the places where you can go. These are just to stimulate some ideas. So some of the areas where you can go in order to add things like affirmations or add information in that can help people change perception or perspective during a visit are shaping function. You can go into neurotransmitters or emotions and click on those and enter them into the shaping function and engage the shaping function. Things like dopamine, for example, is sort of the reward hormone. There are also programs in the... actually, go ahead, next one. Here, the NLP hormones and neurotransmitters screen. You can enter things like dopamine here. So if you go up into this list here, you can draw dopamine down into the hold tray. And while they verbally utter affirmations that are beneficial that the two of you choose together or that they choose, you can hit them with dopamine for 10 seconds. So imagine trying to rewrite an internal dialogue in somebody's mind using a particular affirmation while stimulating dopamine as a reward. Could be something worth trying. Okay. The electrohypnosis program, this is accessed through the test screen and the test screen, and then the left-hand program menu, electrohypnosis comes up. And this is another nice one where you can enter an affirmation or an intention. And part of the benefit is simply just verbalizing it in the first place. So as soon as you're telling them that we're taking this information and we're encoding it into the database that's going to spin it at you a million times, is already telling them this is my affirmation and this is what I'm going to rewrite. Next. The hololinguistic, which are the yellow panels there, are another place where you can enter the tissues that they want to work on, the organs they want to work on, any kind of emotional fixation and affirmation that you want to put in there, and then add to the Schumann wave. Okay. The individual NLP is, you need to be ready for this one. You need to have your coffee down and ready to pay attention. Or just feel like you're really on the, I don't go to this one all the time. It depends on the nature of a conversation, because it can be very, very involved. And you have to be careful to not turn it into a psychotherapy session unless you're a licensed psychotherapist. So when I go here, I try to use it conversationally and lightheartedly to ask, the questions are things like, what's the aberrant thought? The first incident, the last incident. You could be getting into trauma discussion and things like that. And to do it from a lighthearted informational standpoint and just talk about it and tell them how you're going to enter this information and work on reducing a stress response while we talk, is a perfectly reasonable thing to do as long as you're comfortable, you have a good enough relationship with the person, and you know how to pull the chute and bail if you have to, which really just means if it goes somewhere where it's outside of your scope of practice, then you change the subject and you try to relax them, you extend your session if you have to, and you go into some of the other things that are just relaxing overall. Okay? Another one that's really useful is our brain is in a more suggestible state in alpha or theta. And so again, we can have certain kinds of conversations if you're trying to help somebody deal with a change in the way they're thinking or a change in behavior, or if they're stuck, then you can go in and you can stimulate theta or alpha. Well, I think I have the pointer, but anyway, you see it. And then there's a 2-minute therapy button. So while you're engaging certain kinds of conversation, you can stimulate the waveform where we're most conscious or relaxed. Okay, I think we're almost done. Yeah, and these are just some other ideas. So, an adductor has hormone streaming. It's the same thing. You can, if people have different kinds of hormone issues, you can piggyback what you're talking about in your session along with a reward program. Sport enhancement program has help with mental focus and things like that for the same purpose. You can do mental focus while you're having a very engaged conversation. The feel-good zap is serotonin. Using oxytocin or dopamine as a reward. Using the imponderables and zapping imponderables. Sometimes you can go through the list of the top reactive ones, in which, even talking about those with the person, and then using them while you have your conversation can help in the same way. And then same with super learning. And I think that's almost it. Just skip over. There's a couple links you can look at there. And that's it. One more. Woo! We're done. I didn't really do a bunch of button clicking there, and I know sometimes people want to see how the system's used, but I've just found that the most important thing is how you're communicating with people and what kind of relationship you're building with them is more important, because the rest of it is successful. 20 years. All right. Thanks, folks. Yep. Thank you. You want to know about athletes? You'll have to come to the next seminar. We can't do it all in one visit. We need you to come back. I'm not going to leave you totally hanging. The thing is, with athletes, it's almost easier. Because athletes don't have the onion layers, because they're almost more like kids in some circumstances, where if you work with kids, they're kind of easy. They don't have layers and layers and layers of stress. Well, most of the time when you're working with athletes, they do have layers of stress, but a lot of the big ones are already taken care of. And so it's actually fairly simple if you have the approach that the main thing you're doing for athletes is flipping the switch. Because most of them, as they're really competing hard, are moving into overtraining and things like that, and so they're not integrating their training. They're in a fight or flight state. If they're pinned there, their digestion's inhibited, their immune system's inhibited, cognitive function's inhibited. So everything that you're doing, even if you don't think you know what you're doing, is all beneficial. Because you're just trying to relax them, and as soon as they relax, then all those other things that they're doing right. Like, they have to have the big things taken care of. They need to have good coaching. They need to have the right program for training. They need to have the talent. They need to have some of their mental things taken care of. And so the rest is relaxation and recuperation, which is sometimes the hardest, especially as they get more elite. You're welcome.
But I'm not going to let you off that easy either. Jeff Holder. James Holder. When Jeff and I worked at the Olympics, one of the things that was appalling, and one of the reasons I won't work in professional sports again, was because for me, especially working with the Chinese and the Chinese program, an athlete was a product, they were not a person. And so the Chinese and the Chinese program was far more interested in things such as testosterone stimulation, growth hormone stimulation. which we actually had amazing research data to support, amazing biochemical increases, like up to almost 1,000% increases in human growth hormone, which was awesome. And we saw amazing things happen in performance as a byproduct. However, also what we saw a lot of, far too much of, was overtraining, as Jeff was saying, whereby this athlete, because China has so many, an athlete, like I say, was a product, so if they burned through this one, it was okay because there were another 20 behind him that they could put in there. But at the same time, what they weren't recognizing was that they had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in the training of this athlete, because in China it's an all-encompass system. They house, feed, school. These kids live sports. They never get away from it, and they push and they push and they push. And so the ethics for me, what I learned, and I don't know if you had the same experience, Jeff, but the ethics for me, it was insane what we did. We all had virtual mental breakdowns. George and I definitely had breakdowns. I think Jeff managed to get out before his breakdown, but was in the process. Yeah, well, I mean, we were pulling 18-hour days without a day off. Like for... But James Holder, for me, is one of Jeff's greatest success stories. And did you talk about James at all? James Holder is one of Jeff's greatest success stories, and in my opinion, I'm going to force him to quickly tell the story about James Holder. Because Jeff proved if an athlete is holistically, properly trained from the foundation up amidst exactly the things that he just said, what comes out the other side. So I'm very quickly going to ask Jeff to please tell you the James Holder story.
It's not a super quick story, though. Okay. It was a really fun. It was a fun learning experience. James Holder has become a good friend of mine, but I met him in 2005, so this is really quite a long time ago. And he was a decathlete. He was one of Canada's top decathletes. He was an international level decathlete, which they like to consider themselves the utter top of the food chain. And it's kind of debatable that they are, given that they have to be experts in 10 sports. So they're some of the highest trained and extremely athletic, tough people out there. But he was referred in by another athlete that I worked with, and he was very sick. His doctors thought he had rheumatoid arthritis or cancer or AIDS or something. He was, for a couple of months, if he did anything, like he could barely even turn a key in a lock, he could barely get himself up a set of stairs. If he ate anything, he would break out into big welts that were about coaster size all over his body. And if he did any kind of activity, his muscles would swell to the point where his skin was transparent. And so he was just a sick guy. And he'd been put on a stomach medicine, Prevacid. And on our first visit, I said, look, you need to stop your training for a while. Like, you're done until you can get back to a new level of health. And we talked about the stomach medication. From a non-physician perspective, I just educated him about how digestion works and the point of stomach acid. And a lot of times we end up with stomach complaints because of stress state with inadequate signaling to digestion, and we have inhibition of digestion, and so that reduces secretions and mucus and the tightening of the cardiac sphincter, and we get those symptoms. And so the symptom can be resolved with a medication sometimes, but it's really not helping deal with what's underlying, which is the stress state or the overtraining state. So in educating him about it, he made the decision to quit that, and I put him on a brutal stress or a brutal diet, like a total grain-free. It was pure meats, vegetables in his case. And he started losing weight right away, and he was already 180 pounds or whatever, and he started dropping down to 170. I saw him every week. He missed a few months of training. It ended up being 4 months of training that he missed, which would normally be the end of a season for a decathlete, if not every athlete. But his health really started to improve quite quickly, And so he started, even though he was losing weight because of the strict diet, he started to have a major health turnaround. And after, I'd say, three months or so, he started to do a little bit of training and dabbling. And then he decided to get back into training. He's ready to get back into training at 4 months. And so he went to his first day, and it happened to be strength testing day. And he was 10 pounds at that point below normal, and he personal bested in all of his strength tests, like a bench and squats and box jumps and things like that. He was stronger than he'd ever been in his life, and he hadn't even touched anything for 4 months. And so a few weeks after that, he was starting to run again. A few weeks after that, he started participating in mini events where they would have like 3 or 4, and at first he was faster than he'd ever been, and he actually blew his hamstring out, and we had to back up again. And anyway, to make the story shorter, the last thing that we ended up having to do was talking about psychology, because he was ready. He was permitted to compete in the Canadian Nationals after missing 4 months. So he had this coming. And the one conversation we had was, I asked him one day, just out of curiosity, why don't you describe what it's like to be a champion in track and field? And he, sometimes, sorry Americans, but we think about some of the sprinters from the 90s, and oh man, I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best, and it's hard to listen to sometimes. But he said arrogant and conceited and selfish, and all. You had all these kinds of negative ideas, and I said, really, that's interesting. How you have nothing but negative things to say about people who win. How many times have you won? And he goes, F off. I'm always second or third. And so we started to work on perception. And the idea was, now it's time to start to envision that it's already over, that you've already won. Everybody's gone home. What does life look like? Start painting the picture as if it's already done. What's the conversation you're going to have with your parents after you call, et cetera, and start to put yourself in that place. And so for the last few weeks, we started to talk during our sessions as if it was already done and we were moved on. So anyway, he went to the competition and he personal bested in 7 out of 10 events. After 12 years in decathlon and missing 4 months, he won. Went on for probably another 6 months or so in international competition. Met his wife, who's one of the coolest people ever. She was one of the best heptathletes in the country. Got married. He trained her in bobsled. She went on to win World Cups. It just became a great story. But he's now head of combined athletics for Canada. So, yeah, that was a good one. So that was inspiring.
Yeah, Jeff proved if you do it the right way and you focus on holistic nutrition, you focus on listening to the body, supporting the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, and ample stress reduction in tandem with proper visualization and apt goal setting, what was possible with an athlete. And if I ever get back into sports or get the opportunity to work with professional athletes, it is Jeff's example that I will most certainly follow. Thank you so much, Jeff, for sharing with us today.